go this way. This way.
There is 37 acres of land right in the center of Glasgow that is home to more than 50,000 souls. How is that possible? It helps that they're all dead. Glasgow's Necropolis is perhaps the United Kingdom's most famous cemetery. In the 19th century, it was home to Glasgow shipbuilders, high-stakes merchants, slaveholders, nameless civil servants, the murdered, a century's worth of soldiers, and countless children either worked to death or died from disease, accident, or neglect. Necropolis is a microcosm of the city's past, a reminder for the living. It's a window into 19th century Victorian living with all of its rules, traditions, and obligations, a tapestry viewed through a telescope in reverse. By the end of 2022, nearly 50,000 entries in the Graves Register have been entered into a database. Nearly 20,000 of those entries are individuals buried without a gravestone in common ground. Necropolis was founded in 1832, just as the epidemic of grave robbing to satisfy the thirst for corpses by medical colleges was coming to an end. Some years ago, I was living in Newcastle, and on the way home from work every evening, I passed through a cemetery, and I made a point to read the headstones. And it seemed to me that every other grave contained an individual who had been in the military and had been killed during World War I. And I was amazed, because in the United States, municipal cemeteries or privately owned cemeteries don't have that many war dead. One reason is that we didn't suffer the casualties that the United Kingdom did during World War I. And the other reason is that a lot of the war dead in the United States are buried in national cemeteries or military cemeteries or cemeteries owned by the federal government. Not all, but some, or most, I should say. So it was a surprise to me. Now, Necropolis has its share of war dead, but it's a different type of cemetery. It's a very unique cemetery, and it's a cemetery that is very much a reflection of the class divide here in Glasgow. You don't find the poor buried alongside the wealthy. You don't find the poor buried alongside the upper middle class. It's very compartmentalized here. And it's a very much of a reflection of the Victorian era of the 19th century. Glasgow is also a city of architects who plied their skills elaborately as if their profession was one of showmanship rather than the form follows function philosophy. Beaux-Arts, Classical, Greco, Romanesque, Greek Revival, and Gothic designs dotted the city landscape, ranging from the quaint to bombastic in execution. For the layout of Necropolis, the most talented architects were invited to submit proposals. David Cousins, an Edinburgh landscape architect and known for early cemetery design, architect John A. Stevens, and John Baird, an architect known for his classical, Gothic, and Tudor designs. Baird worked with David Hamilton, another architect to design Necropolis, but his layouts were rejected. Instead, Baird and Hamilton were asked by the cemetery's board of directors to produce a patchwork of layouts from several different architects to complete the design of the cemetery. But if we were to satisfy the requirements of a tourist guidebook, we need to look no further than William Miller, the author of the Scottish nursery rhyme Wee Willie Winkie, first published in 1841. The poem goes something like this. Wee Willie Winkie runs through the town, upstairs and downstairs in his nightgown, rapping at windows, searching old nooks, to count the many children reading library books. No less a leading light was Isabella Elder, a Scottish philanthropist known for her charity towards women's education and the welfare of all Glasgow residents. She led the charge in building schools, hospitals, and libraries. Body snatchers, grave robbers, or perhaps the more genteel term of resurrectionist, is the stuff made for ghoulish stories of desperate men robbing graves to feed the insatiable appetite of medical schools for cadavers to teach medicine. Author Robert Louis Stevenson deep dived into horror fiction with his 1884 short story, The Body Snatcher, which was based on the real-life cadaver-obsessed doctor Robert Knox. Stevenson's short stories spawned movies and TV shows, and veteran actors such as Joseph Cotten and Ray Milland, in the twilight of their careers, played emotionally distant, if not deranged men, demanding unfettered access to fresh bodies in schlock horror films. Then there was the infamous Burke and Hare mass murder case, in which William Burke and William Hare were responsible for 16 homicides in 1828 in an effort to deliver bodies to medical schools at a profit. These stories served as a foundation for the image of grave robbing in today's popular culture. It's kind of creepy, isn't it? It's a crypt with a locked gate. It's to keep grave robbers out. In the early 19th century, grave robbers would come into cemeteries, steal bodies, and sell those bodies to medical colleges. Now, in the 19th century, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, the University of Glasgow, and a number of private medical colleges were steeped in controversy over the theft of cadavers that were sold for a profit to these universities for medical experiments, for autopsies, for anatomy lessons, and a teaching tool for medical students. There was a huge public outcry over the theft of cadavers that were sold for profit to medical colleges. The Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons were among a number of colleges that denied that they ever were complicit in stealing bodies to use as a teaching tool for students. However, in the United Kingdom during this period, it was very common for grave robbers and body snatchers to steal bodies and sell them to medical colleges for a profit. However, in Glasgow, there are very few individuals that had an appetite to dig up bodies and sell them. So medical colleges were forced to have their own faculty and their own medical students dig up bodies and use those for medical examinations. The main reason why colleges were forced to exhume bodies illegally was the fact that the enrollment of medical students between 1820 and 1840 was increasing dramatically, and there were not enough bodies to satisfy the demand for teaching. Medical colleges face a dilemma. On the one hand, the public demanded that they stop stealing bodies or be complicit in the theft of bodies for their medical teaching. On the other hand, there's a growing need for cadavers to be used as a teaching tool. The problem was solved in 1832 with the passage of the Resurrectionist Act. This law allowed for the legal purchase of cadavers for the use at medical colleges. It also allowed for individuals who were deceased that had no family members and may be destined to be buried in a potter's field. This increased the flow of cadavers to medical colleges, and so the problem of obtaining bodies for medical purposes was no longer a problem. This also allowed the operators of cemeteries such as Necropolis here to assure safety and to assure relatives of deceased that their loved ones would be safe. I'm walking along a pathway about 200 meters long and about 20 meters wide in the far northeast corner of Necropolis. This is the Jewish enclosure, and between 1833 and 1855, Jewish residents of Glasgow were buried here. They were not permitted to be buried in Christian burial grounds. It wasn't until Necropolis had expanded that it included the Jewish enclosure as part of the cemetery. The Jewish enclosure almost seemed to be an afterthought by Necropolis officials when it became part of the overall park. It's likely that individuals of other faiths are buried there, but unlike Lynn Cemetery, adjacent to Lynn Park across town, Necropolis appears to have no dedicated space for religions other than the Jewish enclosure. Lynn Cemetery, on the other hand, has a large, well-manicured section dedicated to Muslims, with a separate area for infants and young children. As you can see behind me, this cemetery slopes upward on a tall hill. And at the top of the hill, there are a number of tombs and grave markers and monuments that are well designed, and in fact designed by some of the best architects in Glasgow. This points to how the wealthy use their disposable income to honor their dead. And as you get lower on the hillside, you'll notice that the monuments and grave markers are a little less elaborate. And we start at the top with the wealthy, and towards the center of the cemetery, when we're walking down maybe 50 to 100 meters, you'll see that we're upper middle class. There's some elaborate designs on some monuments, but not a lot. And some of them are just the bare bones necessities, marking a grave. Then when you get to the bottom of the cemetery, you'll find out that there's broken markers, and the gravestones are very simple. So even in death, Glasgow had its class divide. Not long after Necropolis came to be, Glasgow became a powerhouse during the Industrial Revolution, as shipbuilding came to the River Clyde. The class divisions were stark. Merchants flourished, becoming leaders of the city and lived in expansive, gated homes. Shipyard, warehouse, and factory workers returned from long hours on the job to tenements. There was a middle class of small and medium-sized business owners. But if there was ever a 1% in Glasgow, it was the shipbuilders, big merchants, and the entrepreneurs who made money off the backs of the enslaved. James Ewing was Lord Provost of Glasgow from 1832 to 1833 and MP for Glasgow from 1832 to 1835. He was a co-founder in 1807 of the pro-slavery lobbying group, the Glasgow West India Association. Here at the top of the hill are where Glasgow's wealthy are buried. Their loved ones had erected magnificent monuments to their memory at a considerable cost. In this case here, the Evangelical Union had erected and funded a monument for James Morrison, who was a reverend here in Glasgow. He was born in Bathgate in 1816 and he died in Glasgow in 1893. He was a preacher at the Clerk's Lane Church, and he was a man ahead of his time, a renegade, if you will, maybe even a rebel. He had preached that Jesus Christ had died for the sins of all men, regardless of distinction or exception. And it was unfortunate that he died before his beliefs had become realized here in Scotland. And in fact, in today's society, we still struggle with the concept of equality among all men. But Reverend Morrison here was preaching this, 150 years ago, 160 years ago. As we descend the hill where Glasgow's wealthy had been buried, we are now descending into the middle portion of the hill, in which you can see that the monuments are much more modest. And here, I would say that these people that are buried here come from upper middle class families. Okay, descending on a steep incline towards street level. A lot of these markers here are unreadable thanks to the passage of time and weather conditions. I see William McFarland here, and I see Thomas Brownlee, but most of the others along this stretch are unreadable. You can see how far down the street is. More than 20 years after the founding of Necropolis, the cemetery received its first murder victim. Alexander Boyd, a ship's carpenter, was entered into the cemetery books on June 16, 1853, simply stating that his cause of death was murder. Boyd left his family in Chile for a voyage as a member of a crew sailing for Glasgow. He roomed with another ship's carpenter, and later he met with his old friend James Law for a pub crawl. Two women, Mary Hamilton and Anne Young, picked them up with the intent of robbing them of their clothes to sell, then dumping them in the street half naked. At Corley's Land, notorious for its criminal activity, they settled in at the women's lodging of a top-floor house. There, Hans Smith McFarland and Helen Blackwood got them drunk. Law passed out, and when they attempted to rob Boyd, he resisted. He was struck on the head with a chamber pot and thrown out the window. He died in the street of a fractured skull and a ruptured liver. McFarland, Blackwood, Young, and Hamilton were arrested. Hamilton was acquitted at trial, and the remaining 3 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death. Young was pardoned, and McFarland and Blackwood were hanged on August 11th.
All Glasgow was alarmed by the evening outbreak in Cheapside Street in the Anderston Dockside area. Nearly 60,000 gallons of whiskey were ablaze, explosive stuff. And as increasing flames roared 200 feet above the rooftops, the question was, could the fire be contained?
Although Glasgow's population in 1960 was approaching 1.7 million people, it still felt to many Glasgow residents that it was a close-knit community. Its working-class roots held an unshakable bond between the residents 6 decades after the end of the Victorian era. That bond was tested in the evening hours of March 28, 1960, when Glasgow's firefighters responded to a fire at a whiskey-bonded warehouse on Cheapside Street.
District be engulfed. The 400 firemen worked in great peril. 25 fire engines, aided by river floats, attacked the blaze. Tragedy came as the brigades fought the inferno. A terrific explosion buried several firemen beneath a wall. In the afternoon, Princess Margaret interrupted her program to visit the scene of the blaze. Like all who saw it, she was appalled. Here, in the space of a few hours, occurred human tragedy. Her Royal Highness expressed deep sympathy with the relatives of the men who died in this terrible fire.
Reefer madness in the 1930s, rock and roll in the 60s, Satan worshiping in the 80s. Each decade seemed to define itself with an urban myth told as much to spread fear as it was to entertain a bored segment of society. For the 1950s, comic books seemed specifically designed to irritate parents and authorities who believed that lurid illustrations and over-the-top storylines were the bane of every child. A rumor popped up in September 1954 in schoolyards in the poverty-stricken neighborhood of Gorbals on the south side of the River Clyde that a 7-foot-tall vampire with iron teeth had killed 2 young boys. After school, about 400 children, ages 4 to 14, descended on Necropolis with clubs, knives, and sticks in search of the vampire. Kids over 3 nights clambered over tombstones and scaled wrought iron fences and trees in search of the monsters. The local press blamed American comic books for the outbreak of hysteria, but few children in Gorbals had access to comic books or television. Few homes had access to such entertainment and struggled just to survive poor sanitation, unemployment, and overcrowding. Logic flew out the window, and Parliament, with no evidence, passed the Children's and Young Persons Harmful Publications Act in 1955 to ban comics deemed harmful to children. Since the passage of the act, only 2 prosecutions were filed. The law remains on the books today. Scarlet fever, tuberculosis, typhoid, and typhus were the biggest enemies of a young child's survival in 19th century Scotland. There was no treatment, there was no cure from the medical community to protect these children. There are countless children buried here at this cemetery who had succumbed to these diseases. In fact, there are no laws to protect children in Victorian-era United Kingdom. They were often required in the middle class and the lower middle class and the poor to perform chores at the ages of 4 or 5. When they're a bit older, maybe 8, 9, 10, they were often required to work in factories to help support the family. They were also often asked to, or told, I should say, to quit school so they can work and support the family. These grueling hours, 12, 14 hours a day, often led to illnesses or industrial accidents that killed many more children. And here we can see testament on these headstones of young children who had died either through accident or through disease. By the late 19th century, the middle class finally began to flourish, with many leaving the tenements behind for single-family homes, enough disposable income to enjoy better clothes, and home furnishings and leisure time for afternoon rides in the park or on the coast. Glasgow's middle class was vibrant and a strong contributor to the city's economic growth. The middle class was dominated by businessmen, ship owners, and skilled engineers and middle managers in shipbuilding and construction. Yet poverty was literally just around the corner. It was breathtaking to see bustling middle-class neighborhoods just a street or two away from the tenements. Failure in helping the poor rise above the slums ruled decade after decade and remained persistent long after the end of the Victorian era and well into the First World War years. As lucky as business owners and well-paid skilled workers were in escaping poverty to move up the social ladder, ill health and death was a constant companion. Industrial cities like Glasgow did not discriminate between the wealthy, middle class, and the poor. Pollution, coal fires, poor drinking water, poor diet, and rat infestations bringing disease made living a long life almost an impossibility. Poor nutrition, either through lack of education or means among the middle class and poor, contributed to the lack of longevity, even as typhus and other diseases were brought under control by the early 20th century. World War I brought profound change to the way the United Kingdom viewed death. Between 1914 and 1918, the number of military casualties was staggering. Nearly 888,000 British soldiers were killed in the war, and another 140,000 civilians died, leaving more than 1 million dead. An estimated 3 million British families lost a close relative in the war, and virtually everyone in Britain lost a friend, cousin, or neighbor.
On the deep blue sea, will you sometimes think of me? I'll be waiting anxiously, soldier boy. Though we're many miles.
Many of the memorials, large and small, erected at Necropolis contain no bodies of soldiers at all, but are rather memorials only. Families of loved ones killed in the war were denied the simple act of a burial in local cemeteries because of the British government's policy of burying war dead where they had fallen. This denied families the comfort of a funeral and further suppressed public mourning and furthered the act of private grieving.
I am proud to see you go, soldier boy, and it makes me love you so.
Major General Douglas Alexander Henry Graham, a senior British Army officer who fought with distinction in both World Wars. He commanded the 153rd Brigade of the 51st Highland Division of North Africa from 1942 to
Days are
1945.
through, for the old red, white, and blue will be here to welcome you, soldier boy.
Lieutenant General James Gearson. He served in the Anglo-Egyptian War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Second Boer War, and in World War I, commanding the 1st Division at the Eastern Command.
Will you sometimes think of me? I'll be waiting anxiously, soldier boy. Though we're many miles apart, soldier boy. Keep my picture near your heart, soldier boy.
Buchanan Gordon of the Scottish Rifles, killed in action in Germany after crossing the Rhine on March 26, 1945, during Operation Plunder.
Au revoir, but not goodbye, soldier boy.
The poor participated in the Industrial Revolution of shipbuilding, railway locomotive manufacturing, and erecting tall buildings. They were not the beneficiaries. That privilege belonged to the elite. To put it starkly, living in the city was dangerous to any person, no matter their station in the social hierarchy. Cholera breakouts were routine and knew no social class. Just after the turn of the 20th century, Glasgow was the most overcrowded city in Britain. Overcrowding and poor plumbing led to sanitation issues. 1 in 7 infants in the 1890s died in Glasgow, mostly from the measles or diarrhea. Ill health among the poor was always pervasive, with poor nutrition and lack of physical exercise. A 1906 school board survey found on average that a 14-year-old boy living in poverty was 4 inches shorter than a 14-year-old living in an affluent area. Rickets, which caused bone damage to up to 1/3 of Glasgow's children, and compromised respiratory conditions were common ailments. Death was so keenly felt by the end of the Victorian era that funerals and mourning rituals became more elaborate and complex. The shame of a loved one buried in a potter's field was so severe that families rather go into deep debt for a well-appointed funeral than surrender to a pauper's burial. By the time war was declared in 1914, the Victorian era and the Edwardian era had passed, and already there was a gradual shift away from mourning rituals of the 19th century. By the end of the war, public expressions of grief and elaborate funerals were replaced by private grieving. Repressing emotions became a coping mechanism. Today in the 21st century, death is not an open discussion in Western society. It's an uncomfortable topic, unlike the 19th century, where death and dying was an open conversation. Melancholy was a common and normal human behavior. Queen Victoria set the standard for grieving and how to perform funerals. Her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, and she went into mourning for the remainder of her life. She grieved, and she wore black, and this helped guide her British subjects in how to deal with death. From a very early age, individuals would save for their own funeral. Their families knew exactly what was expected of them when the time came. They knew that what kind of casket they would need, what kind of burial clothes they would need, and where the person would be buried. The funeral business was booming in the mid to the late 19th century. Embalmers, casket makers, grave diggers, hearse drivers provided a service to help grieving families. Not only did they ease the trauma of the death of a loved one, but they contributed to the economy. Today, Necropolis is a tourist destination and burials are rare. By 1866, burials had peaked at 1,548 for the year, then steeply declined afterwards. 60 years later, only 200 burials were reported for the year, and by 1950, only 100 were registered. By 1995, less than 10 burials were recorded each year. Today, daily tours of Necropolis are staged in multiple languages. Although it remains the final resting place for tens of thousands, its function as a cemetery for Scotland's people is limited today. Yet it is perhaps the best example of hands-on learning of Glasgow's history outside of a museum or the multitude of old mansion tours throughout the United Kingdom.
I belong to Glasgow, dear old Glasgow town, but there's something the matter with Glasgow, for it's going round and round. I'm only a common old working lad, as anyone can see, but when I get a couple of drinks on a Saturday, Glasgow belongs to me.